A journey across the steppes. As night falls, journey with me across Mongolia's vast steppes, where history's greatest land empire once stretched from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. The Mongol saga transcends conquest, revealing cultural exchange, innovation, and trade networks that connected East with West centuries before modern era. Close your eyes and travel to the windswept grasslands, where Temujin, a boy born clutching a blood clot, rose from poverty to become Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Breathe deeply as we witness the birth of an empire that would forever alter human history. The rise of Genghis Khan, from outcast to emperor. In the harsh wilderness of the Mongolian plateau, around the year 1162, a child was born to Yizji, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, and his wife Holan. They named him Temüjin after a Tatar chieftain his father had captured. The Mongolia of Temujin's birth was no unified nation, but a patchwork of nomadic tribes, Tatars, Merkits, Naimans, Karaites, and dozens more locked in constant cycles of raiding, alliance, and betrayal. Life on the steppes was brutally difficult. Winters brought temperatures plunging to 40 below zero, while summer droughts could decimate the herds upon which survival depended. In this unforgiving landscape, only the strongest and most adaptable survived. From his earliest days, Temujin learned the skills of the nomadic warrior, riding at full gallop before he could walk, shooting a bow from horseback with deadly accuracy, and enduring days without food or shelter. But even by the harsh standards of steppe life, the boy's childhood would prove exceptionally difficult. When he was just 9 years old, his father took him to the family of his betrothed, Bert, to arrange their marriage, and left him there to be raised by his future in-laws, as was Mongolian custom. On his journey home, the chieftain accepted food from Tatars, who recognized him as an enemy and poisoned him. As he lay dying, he sent a trusted companion to bring his son back to the family. Upon his father's death, the members of the clan abandoned Temujin's family, refusing to be led by a child. The deepest water dries up. The brightest stone crumbles, they told his mother, taking even the ancestral herds that were the family's only source of sustenance. Left without protection or resources, the widow and her children were forced to survive on roots, berries, and small game, living as outcasts on the margins of tribal society. When the master dies, the servants scatter like drifting smoke. When the mother tree falls, the saplings cannot stand alone, goes an old Mongolian proverb, and so it seemed for this abandoned family. This period of devastating poverty forged Temujin's character. With his mother and siblings, he learned to hunt marmots and fish, to make clothes from the skins of field mice sewn together, and to find strength in family loyalty when all external support had vanished. His resilient mother taught her children that their only hope of survival lay in perfect unity. Together you can withstand any enemy, but a single arrow is easily broken. Yet tragedy continued to stalk the young boy. When he was around 12 years old, he killed his half-brother Bektor in a dispute over hunting spoils, establishing his dominance within the family, but living with the grave consequences of fraternal bloodshed, one of the most serious crimes in Mongol society. Shortly after this incident, disaster struck again. The Taikyad clan, once followers of his father, captured Temujin and kept him in a wooden collar designed for slaves. For days, he was displayed from yurt to yurt as an object of curiosity and derision. But one night, seeing his guards distracted during a celebration, the captive smashed his wooden collar against a rock and fled into the night. A Taikid pursuer spotted him hiding in the shallows of a river, but inexplicably chose not to reveal his location. This mysterious act of mercy would long be remembered by Temujin, who later rewarded the man named Sorkin Shira when he rose to power. Even in these darkest moments, the future ruler was learning which acts of kindness and cruelty would shape his own leadership. After escaping from captivity, he reunited with his family and soon sought out his betrothed, Bert. Their marriage created an alliance with her tribe, the Conquests, giving him his first political connection and the beginnings of a power base. As a wedding gift, he received a magnificent black sable coat, a treasure he would soon put to strategic use. Understanding that a man without allies on the steppes was basically a goner, Temujin set out to find Togrul, the Khan of the Karaites and a blood brother to his late father. He brought along a valuable sable coat as a gift, and with that gesture, he secured Togrul's promise of support. He boldly declared, "I'll be your right hand, and together we'll unite the felt tent-dwelling people." This alliance couldn't have come at a better time. Just after his marriage, warriors from the Merkit tribe, who had once kidnapped his mother, raided his camp and took his new wife. In a quest for revenge, with Togrul's backing and the help of his childhood friend and future rival, Shamuka, Temujin launched his first military campaign. After several months of captivity, he successfully rescued Bert. Her return was a mix of joy and complexity, though. She was pregnant, and the child, Joki, would always carry the weight of uncertain paternity. Still, Temujin embraced the boy as his own, showing a practical approach to family and loyalty that would later shape his empire building. For him, competence and loyalty were far more important than birth or background, which was a pretty revolutionary idea in the rigid tribal society of the time. After the campaign against the Merkits, Temujin's reputation skyrocketed. He had this incredible knack for attracting followers, not through tribal ties, but through personal loyalty. He broke away from tradition, promoting men based on their merit instead of their family connections. He offered advancement to anyone who proved their worth, even former enemies. This fresh take on meritocracy drew in talented and ambitious folks, especially from lesser-known clans who saw a chance to rise with his growing power. However, as Temujin's influence expanded, it started to strain his relationship with Jamuka. The two represented different leadership styles. Jamuka clung to the traditional aristocratic ways, while Temujin was all about personal loyalty and merit. When their paths diverged around 1182, their followers had to pick sides, kicking off a long struggle for supremacy. This conflict dragged on for nearly 2 decades, filled with battles, betrayals, and shifting alliances that gradually brought the Mongol tribes under Temujin's banner. By 1186, Jamuka's supporters declared him Gur Khan, Universal Khan, making it clear that only one man could ultimately lead the Mongol tribes. During this tumultuous time, Temujin showed the strategic brilliance that would eventually reshape entire continents. After facing a significant defeat at 13 sides, he wisely chose to retreat and regroup instead of making a desperate stand. He formed alliances with his opponent's enemies, including the powerful Karaites, his father's old allies. But when these relationships soured, like with Togrul around 1203, Temujin didn't hesitate to eliminate former supporters who had become obstacles. By 1206, after years of warfare, alliance building, and political maneuvering, he achieved what no one had done before: the unification of all Mongol and Turkic tribes of the steppe. At a grand assembly called a Kurultai, held near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldan, the tribal leaders lifted him onto a felt carpet and proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler and supreme leader of a unified Mongol nation. The boy who once faced abandonment and starvation on the steppes now stood as the unrivaled ruler of the largest confederation of nomadic peoples in history. Shamuka, once Temujin's blood brother, was finally captured after years of conflict. Instead of accepting Temujin's offer to reconcile, he asked for a noble death without bloodshed. Respecting his wish, the new Khan executed him by breaking his back, a fitting end for a prince, and buried him with honor, paying tribute to a man who had been both his closest friend and fiercest rival. At the Kurultai, Genghis Khan wasted no time in transforming this tribal confederation into a disciplined state. He rolled out the yasa, a legal code that set standard laws for all tribes. He also created a military system based on units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 called tumen, shaking up the old tribal groupings. Plus, he set up a basic bureaucracy and a network of messengers, known as arrow-bearers, who could quickly spread his commands across the vast lands now under his control. But perhaps the biggest change was dismantling the old tribal aristocracy. He replaced it with a new elite based on loyalty and service to him. The sons of defeated chiefs were either executed or pushed aside, while loyal followers, no matter their background, were given positions of power. He even formed a personal guard unit, the Keshig, whose members would become his most trusted generals and administrators. By the age of 44, Genghis Khan had completed the first chapter of his incredible journey from outcast to emperor. But he wasn't just aiming to rule the Mongols. Standing before the gathered leaders at the Kurultai, he boldly declared, "I have risen from the brown earth to the throne of gold. I plan to bring the entire world under my hoofbeats." The warriors, seasoned by years of tribal warfare, now looked beyond the steppes to the settled civilizations around them. The rich but fractured Middle Kingdom of China to the south, the Muslim empires to the west, and the distant kingdoms of Europe. With a united people behind him and a military machine sharpened by conflict, the Khan was ready to launch the greatest series of conquests the world had ever seen. The nomad had transformed into an emperor, and the world was about to witness the unstoppable force of the Mongol war machine. As Genghis Khan gazed toward the horizon, the vast empires beyond the steppes had no idea of the storm brewing, a storm that would change the course of human history forever. How the Mongol war machine crushed entire kingdoms. As the dust settled after the epic Kurultai of 1206, Genghis Khan found himself at the dawn of a new era. Uniting the Mongol tribes wasn't just the end of a struggle. It was the start of something huge. With the steppes now united under his banner, the new Khan set his sights on the settled civilizations that had long viewed nomadic peoples as mere barbarians. Little did these kingdoms realize that from the chaos of tribal warfare had risen the most powerful military force the medieval world would ever face. Genghis Khan's army was more than just a bunch of skilled fighters. It was a game-changing military force built for massive conquests. Every part of this army combined steppe traditions with smart innovations that totally changed the way wars were fought. At the core of the steppe military was the horse archer, possibly the most fearsome warrior of the pre-modern world. These kids were practically born on horseback, learning to ride before they could even walk, and they started training with bows as soon as they could. By the time they became adults, they could hit targets while galloping full speed, fire off multiple arrows in a flash, and move with a skill that infantry armies could hardly grasp. Their composite bows were incredible, made from wood, horn, and sinew. They outperformed most weapons of the time. With a draw weight over 160 pounds and a range of 300 yards or more, these archers could take down enemy formations long before those foes even knew what hit them. Each warrior carried 2 or 3 bows and up to 300 arrows, including special armor-piercing ones for tougher opponents. Genghis Khan set up his fierce army using a decimal system that moved beyond old tribal ties. He grouped warriors into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. This smart organization made it easier to control and communicate over long distances and tricky battlefields. The best part? It created a meritocracy where leaders were chosen based on skill and loyalty, not just their background. This game-changing idea let the most talented fighters climb the ranks, no matter where they came from. Discipline was strict. The penalty for desertion, leaving a comrade behind, or not sharing loot properly was death. But this tough discipline came with big rewards. These warriors got a bigger cut of the spoils than soldiers in most other armies, which really boosted loyalty and motivation. As a Persian chronicler put it, each man is worth more than 10 of their enemies, because they all gain when they win and all perish when they lose. Genghis Khan knew that winning wars was just as much about strategy in the mind as it was about the actual fighting. He turned psychological warfare into a true art, using fear as a weapon with chilling effectiveness. Before launching attacks on major kingdoms, his army would wipe out smaller towns that resisted, but they spared those that surrendered quickly. The survivors often joined his ranks or were sent ahead to spread stories of destruction, creating a terrifying reputation that preceded his main force. As rumors of entire cities being destroyed and people slaughtered spread, many potential enemies chose to surrender rather than fight back. These conquerors cultivated their fearsome reputation with calculated public displays of brutality. After capturing the Tangut city of Wahai in 1209, they executed the defending general by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears. Gruesome spectacle designed not merely as punishment, but as a message that would travel faster than any army. Yet this terror was applied with strategic restraint. Cities that surrendered without resistance were generally spared, their skilled artisans and craftsmen conscripted rather than killed, and their existing governance structures often left intact under the Khan's oversight. This created a powerful incentive for submission rather than resistance, allowing his forces to absorb vast territories without fighting for every inch. As one advisor reportedly told Genghis Khan, "The greatest joy a man can know is to conquer his enemies and drive them before him, to ride their horses and take away their possessions, to see the faces of those who were dear to them bedewed with tears, and to clasp their wives and daughters in his arms." What truly distinguished the steppe military from its contemporaries was its unmatched operational mobility and flexibility. While other medieval armies typically moved at 10 to 12 miles per day, these horsemen could cover 60 to 100 miles when necessary. Each warrior maintained a string of 3 to 5 horses, switching mounts regularly to prevent exhaustion. Without the need for slow-moving supply trains, the Khan's armies could appear seemingly out of nowhere, striking before defenders could prepare. Rather than relying on static formations, these nomadic warriors mastered the art of fluid battlefield tactics. Their signature maneuver was the feigned retreat, drawing enemy forces into a disorganized pursuit before turning to envelop and destroy them. At the Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223, Russian forces pursued what they thought was a beaten detachment for 9 days, becoming strung out and vulnerable before the steppe fighters turned and annihilated them completely. Genghis Khan's generals were masters of the envelopment, using carefully coordinated movements to surround enemy forces from multiple directions. At the Battle of Yuling in 1211 against the Jin Dynasty, his forces split into 3 divisions, attacked from unexpected directions, and trapped the numerically superior Jin army in a devastating encirclement. Unlike many contemporary powers, these nomadic conquerors proved remarkably adaptable to new challenges. When confronting the walled cities of China obstacles, the steppe warriors had little experience with. They quickly absorbed Chinese siege expertise. They recruited engineers from conquered territories, learned to construct and operate catapults, trebuchets, and other siege engines, and developed innovative tactics like diverting rivers to undermine city walls. This adaptability extended to naval warfare as well, despite coming from a landlocked steppe environment. The forces under Genghis Khan's successors would eventually build fleets to attack Japan and Java, though with less success than their land campaigns. The first settled civilization to face the full might of Genghis Khan's unified army was the Western Xia, a sophisticated Buddhist kingdom controlling valuable trade routes between China and Central Asia. In 1205, just before the Kurultai that proclaimed him Genghis Khan, Temujin began raiding Tangut territory, testing their defenses and response. The full invasion began in 1207, and it revealed the pattern that would characterize many future campaigns. Initial resistance was met with overwhelming force. When the Tanguts rejected the Khan's demands for submission and tribute, his forces systematically reduced their fortified cities, diverting rivers to flood defenses and employing Chinese siege engines against major fortifications. By 1210, the Western Xia ruler submitted, accepting vassal status and providing troops for future campaigns. With this first conquest secured, Genghis Khan immediately turned his attention to a far greater prize, the Jin Dynasty, which ruled northern China. The Jin campaign began in 1211 with a 3-pronged invasion that caught the Jin defenses unprepared. Despite commanding a vastly larger population and resources, including a standing army of over 1 million soldiers, the Jin proved unable to counter the mobility and tactical brilliance of the steppe warriors. At the Battle of Yuling, a Jin army of over 500,000 faced approximately 100,000 of Genghis Khan's warriors. Through a series of feigned retreats and flanking maneuvers, the nomadic forces split the Jin armies and destroyed them piecemeal, killing an estimated 60,000 Jin soldiers while suffering minimal losses. Following this devastating victory, the Khan's troops systematically reduced Jin cities over the next several years. The Jin capital of Zhengdu fell in 1215 after a brutal siege. When the starving residents finally surrendered, the conquerors executed all officials and military officers before thoroughly looting the city. Refugees reported that the streets were slippery with fat from the massive slaughter that followed. While the final conquest of the Jin would wait until after Genghis Khan's death, the empire had been fatally weakened by his campaigns. One of the most remarkable aspects of Genghis Khan's generalship was his ability to coordinate military operations across multiple distant fronts simultaneously. Even while prosecuting the Jin campaign, he dispatched forces westward to subdue the Khwarazmian Empire that controlled much of Central Asia. Led by his brilliant general, Jib the Arrow, the Khan's forces invaded Khwarazmian territory in 1216. Rather than relying solely on military force, Jib exploited internal divisions, forming alliances with discontented vassal rulers and religious minorities oppressed under Kara-Kitai rule. This combination of military pressure and political manipulation led to the rapid collapse of the empire by 1218, adding vast territories to the growing domain of the steppe conquerors. The conquest of Kara-Kitai had profound strategic implications. It extended Genghis Khan's control to the borders of the powerful Khwarazmian Empire, creating a new and dangerous neighbor. It also gave his realm control over the lucrative east-west commerce that had flowed for centuries. Merchants who had previously paid taxes to multiple powers now dealt with a single authority, presaging the Pax Mongolica that would later connect distant parts of Eurasia. Behind the dramatic battles and sieges lay perhaps the greatest military innovation of these nomadic conquerors, a logistical system far ahead of its time. While contemporary armies relied on slow-moving supply trains vulnerable to interdiction, the steppe forces lived off the land with remarkable efficiency. Each warrior carried dried meat paste, yogurt, and other preserved foods that could sustain him for days without resupply. They drank blood from their horses' veins in emergencies, carefully making small incisions that would not permanently harm their most valuable military asset. Their felt tents provided shelter in any weather conditions, and their ability to travel with minimal equipment allowed for operational speeds that confounded enemies. Intelligence gathering formed another crucial component of the Khan's military success. Before major campaigns, Genghis Khan would dispatch merchants, spies, and diplomatic missions to collect detailed information about potential targets. These reconnaissance efforts mapped terrain, identified key fortifications, assessed political divisions that could be exploited, and even cataloged the personalities of enemy leaders to predict their reactions. During campaigns, his forces maintained a sophisticated communication system using horses, signal fires, and arrow messengers that could transmit commands over vast distances at unprecedented speeds. This allowed Genghis Khan to coordinate multiple army groups separated by hundreds of miles, converging them with timing that repeatedly caught enemies by surprise. The military brilliance of these conquests came at a staggering human cost. Contemporary chroniclers claimed that the campaigns in northern China reduced the population by tens of millions, while modern historians consider these figures exaggerated. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread abandonment of previously populated areas and significant demographic decline. Beyond direct casualties from combat, these invasions triggered famine and disease as agricultural systems collapsed. In parts of northern China, farmlands reverted to pasture or forest as peasant populations were killed or fled. Similar patterns would later emerge in Central Asia and the Middle East, where sophisticated irrigation systems built over centuries fell into disrepair following the conquests. Yet there was a cold strategic logic to this devastation. For Genghis Khan, depopulated regions became grazing lands for his horses, converting agricultural land back to pasture that sustained the nomadic lifestyle and military power of his people. As one scholar observed, in a very real sense, they were not conquering land, but harvesting it. By 1219, just 13 years after unifying the tribes, Genghis Khan ruled an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of the Islamic world. The Western Xia had been subjugated, the Jin Dynasty was crumbling, and the Kara-Kitai had been absorbed into his growing realm. Yet the greatest challenges and the most devastating campaigns still lay ahead. As the great Khan gathered his forces on the border of the Khwarazmian Empire, he sent a message to Shah Muhammad that revealed both his confidence and his worldview. I am the master of the lands of the rising sun, while you rule those of the setting sun. Let us conclude a firm treaty of friendship and peace. The Shah's response would trigger one of history's most devastating military campaigns, as the steppe war machine prepared to descend upon the Islamic world with unprecedented fury. The nomads who had once been dismissed as barbarians by their civilized neighbors had proven themselves masters of warfare on a scale that would reshape continents. As you drift towards sleep, consider how this military revolution built on horseback, archery, psychological warfare, and brilliant leadership would continue to transform the world in ways that echoed down to our present day. The invasion of Persia, the destruction of the Khwarazm Empire in 1218, while Genghis Khan was solidifying his power in northern China and Central Asia, he set his sights on a new target, a sprawling Khwarazmian Empire. This was a powerful Muslim realm that included what we now know as Iran, Afghanistan, and much of Central Asia. Under the rule of Shah Muhammad II, the empire was thriving, thanks to its control of the Silk Road. It boasted a massive army and magnificent cities that stood as shining examples of Islamic culture and learning. What happened next turned out to be one of history's biggest showdowns. A clash between the relentless nomadic warriors of the steppes and a well-established Islamic empire, forever changing the landscape of the Middle East. But here's the twist. Unlike many of Genghis Khan's other campaigns, this war didn't kick off because of a thirst for land. Instead, it all started with a diplomatic blunder that spiraled into a massive act of revenge. Genghis Khan sent a caravan of 450 merchants to Khwarazm in hopes of starting peaceful trade relations. Along with them, he sent a message to Shah Muhammad. I rule the lands of the rising sun, and you rule those of the setting sun. Let's form a solid treaty of friendship. At first, the Shah was cautious, but seemed interested, sending gifts back. But then, things took a turn for the worse. At the border city of Otrar, the governor In-ul-Haq accused the merchants of spying, seized their goods, and executed the entire caravan. When Genghis Khan sent another diplomatic mission to check on things, the Shah had almost all the ambassadors killed, leaving just one alive. To add insult to injury, their beards were burned off, a huge disgrace in Mongol culture. To the Mongols, ambassadors were like sacred messengers. Killing them wasn't just a slight, but a serious offense against the natural order. When Genghis Khan got the news, he reportedly went off by himself to a mountaintop for 3 days and nights, connecting with the eternal blue sky. After that, he came back with a cold determination. Persian chroniclers noted that he proclaimed, I will give the control of these cities to my youngest son, but first, I'll make sure they're in a state where my horses can frolic in their palaces. Instead of acting out of rage, the Mongols planned their response with careful precision. Throughout 1219, Genghis Khan gathered what might have been the largest nomadic army ever, possibly around 200,000 warriors from all over his expanding empire. He personally led the charge, bringing his sons Joki, Chagatai, Gedai, and Tolui along to learn the ways of war and conquest. Now, Shah Muhammad had a much bigger army, maybe 400,000 strong. But instead of using his numbers wisely for big battles, he made a huge mistake. Worried about the Mongols' mobile warfare, he scattered his forces across various garrison cities in his vast empire, which allowed the Mongols to pick them off one by one. The invasion kicked off in early 1220, with Mongol forces splitting into multiple columns to overwhelm the Shah's defenses. The city of Otrar, where the initial incident had happened, fell after a grueling 5-month siege. True to his reputation for exacting revenge, Genghis Khan saved special punishment for Inul-Haq, the governor who had ordered the massacre of the merchants. The punishment was brutal. Molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a death that symbolized his greed. But Otrar's fall was just the beginning. The grand cities of Transoxiana Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench stood in the Mongols' path, each a hub of Islamic learning and culture, fortified with strong walls and plenty of soldiers. The fate of these cities would showcase the terrifying efficiency of Mongol warfare. Bukhara, one of the key cultural centers in the Islamic world, was the first major city to face the Mongol onslaught. Its outer defenses crumbled quickly. In March 1220, the garrison tried to make a breakout, but was hunted down and slaughtered by the swift Mongol cavalry. When the city finally surrendered, Genghis Khan rode into the main mosque, declared himself the flail of God, and demanded the city's leaders to present their hidden treasures. After thoroughly looting Bukhara, the Mongols used a tactic they'd repeat throughout the campaign. They forced the city's population to act as human shields for their next target, Samarkand. Watching their neighbors driven before the Mongol army, compelled to fill moats with their bodies or charge the walls ahead of the Mongol troops, left a lasting psychological impact on each subsequent city. Samarkand, with its massive walls and a garrison of 100,000 soldiers, was thought to be unbeatable, yet it fell within days. The Turkish mercenaries in the city tried to surrender separately, but Genghis Khan had them executed, sending a clear message that resistance and betrayal were futile. The city's artisans, about 30,000 skilled craftsmen, were taken to Mongolia to serve the growing empire, while many remaining inhabitants were killed. As these great cities fell, Shah Muhammad chose to flee westward instead of facing the invaders, a move that demoralized both his forces and the civilian population. Relentlessly pursued by a special Mongol unit led by generals Jib and Sabotai, the once mighty ruler was eventually trapped on a small island in the Caspian Sea, where he died alone and in despair in early 1221. The Shah's death didn't slow the Mongol advance. If anything, the campaign became even more systematic and devastating. The city of Urgench, the capital of Khwarazm, put up a fierce fight, resisting street by street against the invaders. Furious at this unexpected challenge, the Mongols diverted the Amu Darya River to flood the city. When it finally fell after a 6-month siege, the vengeance was horrifying. Accounts from the time claim that each Mongol warrior was given 24 civilians to execute personally. While those numbers might be exaggerated, archaeological evidence backs up a massive population decline. The great cultural centers of eastern Persia faced similar fates. Merv, Nishapur, and Herat cities, famous throughout the Islamic world for their libraries, observatories, and universities, were systematically wiped out. In 1221, at Merv, the population was ordered to evacuate and then methodically killed in groups outside the city. Modern historians estimate that hundreds of thousands perished. After the city of Nishapur revolted and killed a Mongol general who happened to be Genghis Khan's son-in-law, the retribution was especially brutal. The city was completely destroyed, with separate piles reportedly made of men, women, and children. Even cats and dogs met the same fate. The destruction that the Khwarazmian Empire faced was truly shocking, even by the brutal standards of medieval warfare. Historians believe that the population of Persia might have dropped by as much as 75% in the areas hit hardest by the Mongol invasion. Those impressive irrigation systems that had kept Persian agriculture thriving for centuries were wrecked, turning once lush farmland into barren desert. Cities that had been hubs of knowledge and culture for hundreds of years were either completely abandoned or shrunk down to tiny towns. Persian chroniclers didn't hold back in describing the psychological toll of this disaster. One writer summed it up with a haunting line: "They came, they destroyed, they burned, they killed, they plundered, they departed." Another starkly noted, "If a monster were to emerge in 1,000 years, it would be less monstrous than Genghis Khan." This invasion was so deeply traumatic that Persian historians dubbed it the disaster, seeing it as a divine punishment for the sins of the Muslim world. But even in the midst of all this chaos, there were hints of how the future Mongol Empire could be more constructive. Cities that surrendered peacefully, like Balkh, were often spared from destruction. Genghis Khan showed respect for Islamic religious leaders who approached him without hostility, making sure their places of worship were protected. And despite his fierce reputation, he kept a tight grip on his forces, ensuring that looting and violence were carried out with specific goals in mind, rather than letting things spiral into chaos. By 1222, the bulk of the Persian campaign was winding down. Instead of immediately appointing governors and establishing direct rule, Genghis Khan left much of the conquered land in ruins and without leadership as he pulled back most of his forces. It would take time for Mongol administrators to move in and start rebuilding and governing, a process that would pick up speed under his successors. As the main Mongol army headed back east, a smaller force of about 20,000 warriors, led by generals Jib and Subutai, continued westward on what was supposed to be a reconnaissance mission. This seemingly small group would go on to defeat the kingdoms of the Caucasus, wipe out a combined Russian army at the Battle of the Khalkha River, and raid through Crimea before rejoining the main Mongol force. This 3-year, 5,500-mile circular campaign showcased the incredible operational reach of Mongol armies. The fall of the Khwarazmian Empire was a pivotal moment in world history. It opened up Central Asia and Persia to direct Mongol control, created a power vacuum in the Islamic world that would take generations to fill, and sent refugees scattering in all directions, spreading stories of the unstoppable horsemen from the east. Among those who fled was a young scholar named Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who would become one of the greatest scientists of the medieval Islamic world. Initially kidnapped by the assassin sect, he would later work with the Mongols, establishing the famous Maraga Observatory under their support. This was just a glimpse of how out of chaos and destruction a new cultural blend could emerge. For Genghis Khan, the Khwarazmian campaign was the pinnacle of his conquests and a testament to his strategic genius. Even in his 60s, he led his armies across thousands of miles of tough terrain in Asia. In less than 2 years, he dismantled one of the most powerful empires in the Islamic world and sent a clear message to any ruler who might think of opposing him: submit or face total destruction. As he wrapped up the Persian campaign, the great Khan shifted his focus back to China, where there was still unfinished business with the Jin Dynasty and Western Xia. But here's the thing: the playbook for Mongol conquest was already set. It was all about overwhelming military strength, calculated terror, and a savvy political approach that would guide his successors as they pushed the empire even further. The Khwarazmian campaign also showed us something key about the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan. Unlike many conquerors who just wanted to rule existing states and rake in tribute, the Mongols, under his leadership, were ready to totally transform the societies they conquered. They didn't hesitate to smash old power structures and rebuild them to fit their nomadic needs. Cities? They could be sacrificed if needed. Populations? Relocated? Entire landscapes? Converted from farmland to pasture. This mindset of reshaping the world-seeing conquest, not just as occupation, but as a chance for transformation, helps explain both the incredible destructiveness of Mongol invasions and their revolutionary impact on Eurasian civilization. As survivors started to piece their shattered world back together, they did so in a new reality. The dynamics of power, trade, and culture had shifted dramatically thanks to the horse lords from the steppes. As you drift off to sleep, picture the aftermath of this great storm that swept through Persia. Imagine the ruined cities slowly coming back to life, trade tentatively resuming along the ancient Silk Road, now under Mongol protection. And think about how, even as the physical wounds began to heal, the psychological impact of the Mongol conquest would influence Persian literature, art, and historical memory for generations, a testament to how thoroughly Genghis Khan fulfilled his promise of vengeance. But hold on, the story of Mongol conquest isn't over yet. Even while Persia struggled to recover, the shadow of Mongol expansion loomed over new lands to the west, across the Russian principalities into Eastern Europe, and right toward the heart of medieval Christendom. The next big clash between the nomadic empire and settled societies was just around the corner, set to unfold on the plains of Russia and Hungary, as Genghis Khan's successors carried on his vision of world conquest into Europe. The Mongols versus Europe, how they almost conquered the West, even though Genghis Khan never personally led any campaigns into Europe. He definitely set the stage for an invasion during his lifetime. His generals Jibi and Sabotai went on a reconnaissance mission that swept through the Caucasus and into the Russian steppes, coming back with some pretty valuable intel about the lands waiting beyond the western horizon. Picture this. It's 1236, 14 years after Genghis Khan's death, and you're in Eastern Europe, where whispers of a fearsome army are spreading like wildfire. By this time, Gedai Khan, Genghis Khan's third son and chosen successor, is in charge, and he's not slowing down. The campaign aimed at Europe was handed over to Bata Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, along with the brilliant Subutai, who, despite being in his 60s, was still a masterful military strategist who played a huge role in building the empire. Now, the army that gathered for this European adventure wasn't the biggest ever, but it was definitely one of the most experienced and disciplined. With around 130,000 warriors, this force included veterans from various campaigns across Asia and the Middle East. Many of the commanders had even been trained by Genghis Khan himself in the complex tactics of steppe warfare. This wasn't just a raiding party. It was a full-on invasion force with a mission to bring the European kingdoms under the Great Khan's rule. The invasion kicked off with an attack on the Volga Bulgars in 1236, swiftly taking over this wealthy trading state that controlled key river routes in the area. After that, the forces split into multiple columns to methodically conquer the principalities that would eventually become Russia. By this time, the once mighty Kiev and Rus, a loose federation of East Slavic principalities centered around Kiev, was already weakened by internal conflicts. One prince after another made the huge mistake of facing the invaders alone instead of banding together. The great cities of the Rus fell one after another. Ryazan succumbed after a 5-day siege in December 1237, followed by Vladimir Suzdal and countless smaller settlements. Chroniclers from that time wrote that no eye remained to weep for the dead, as entire populations were either massacred or scattered into the forests. The city of Novgorod in the north was spared only because the spring thaw turned the ground into mud, making it impossible for cavalry to advance. This general mud turned out to be one of the few reliable allies against the eastern invasion, as campaigns were usually timed around the seasons to ensure solid ground for horses. The jewel of Russian cities, Kiev, fell in December 1240 after a fierce siege. The attackers unleashed their full arsenal of siege techniques, catapults, mining operations, and psychological warfare. When the city finally fell, it was so utterly destroyed that visitors in later years reported seeing huge mounds of skulls and bones where the magnificent city had once stood. The metropolitan of the Orthodox Church fled rather than submit to the new rulers, a trend that would repeat across Eastern Europe. With the Rus principalities in ruins, the Mongol advance continued westward at a shocking pace. By early 1241, the Eastern forces were ready to strike at the heart of Central Europe. They employed their signature strategy of multiple, coordinated advances. One force under Beta Khan moved through Poland, while another under Subotai set its sights on Hungary. The timing was spot on. Both armies were meant to converge on the Hungarian plain, perfect for steppe cavalry operations. Unlike China or the Islamic world, the kingdoms of Europe had no experience with such sophisticated nomadic armies. The heavy cavalry of medieval Europe was trained to deliver powerful charges, but lacked the mobility and adaptability of the steppe horse archers. European infantrymen, mainly peasant levies, were even less prepared for the speed and ferocity of the Eastern warriors. On April 9, 1241, a Polish army, backed by German Teutonic Knights, faced off against the northern Mongol force at Legnica. Leading the European troops was Duke Henry II of Silesia, who had rallied a strong army made up of Polish, German, and Moravian soldiers. But just like many before him, Henry was caught off guard by the battlefield tactics he was about to encounter. The Battle of Legnica kicked off with a disciplined Polish charge that initially pushed back the light cavalry. But this was all part of a clever feigned retreat, one of the classic tricks of the steppe warriors. As the Polish knights chased what they thought was a retreating enemy, they got strung out and disorganized. Meanwhile, behind the Polish lines, the invaders unleashed a psychological weapon that had never been seen in Europe: smoke bombs that created thick, confusing clouds on the battlefield. When the Eastern forces suddenly turned and counterattacked, they caught the Polish knights right where they wanted them, perfectly positioned for their composite bows. The heavy armor of the European knights offered some protection, but the attackers aimed for the knights' horses, bringing these elite warriors crashing down and leaving them exposed. Once the knights were separated and unable to regroup, the Mongol warriors closed in with lances and sabers for the kill. The defeat was devastating. Duke Henry was killed, and his head was displayed on a spear outside the walls of Legnica. The destruction of his army was so complete that the victors reportedly collected 9 large sacks of ears from fallen European warriors, a gruesome way to tally their victories. Just 2 days after the battle at Legnica, Subutai's main force confronted the Hungarian army led by King Bela IV at Mohi, near the Sajo River. The Hungarian kingdom was one of the strongest in Europe, and Bela had gathered a massive force of around 80,000 men, the largest European army to face the eastern threat. Subutai, showing the tactical genius that made him Genghis Khan's most trusted general, set an intricate trap. Under the cover of night, he secretly built a pontoon bridge across the Sayo River, while launching a noisy diversionary attack at the main bridge. When the Hungarian forces rushed to defend the obvious crossing point, warriors poured across the makeshift bridge and flanked the European army. The Hungarians had set up a defensive wagon fortress, a circular lager where they could retreat and regroup. But this position turned into a death trap when Mongol archers surrounded it, raining arrows on the packed troops inside. When the Hungarians tried to break out, they found that Subutai had intentionally left a seeming gap in the encirclement to the west. However, it was just a killing zone where hidden heavy cavalry lay in wait to obliterate the fleeing troops. The Battle of Mohi was perhaps the most complete victory in Europe. An estimated 70,000 Hungarians lost their lives, essentially wiping out Hungary's military strength in a single day. King Bela barely escaped with his life, fleeing to a small fortress on the Adriatic Sea as pursuing detachments relentlessly hunted him across his shattered kingdom. In the wake of these twin victories, the conquerors systematically occupied Hungary and raided into Austria, Croatia, Bulgaria, and Romania. Contemporary European sources described their advance with apocalyptic dread. They came swarming like locusts over the face of the earth, bringing terrible devastation to the eastern parts, laying waste with fire and carnage. By the end of 1241, the armies from the east had reached the gates of Vienna and the shores of the Adriatic. Scouts were spotted on the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, near the cities of Vienna, Neumarkt, and Klosterneuburg. Europe seemed on the brink of falling to the same devastating conquest that had already swept through much of Asia. Then, in what turned out to be one of history's most significant twists, the advance suddenly stopped. On December 11th, 1241, Grand Khan Gedai died in Mongolia, forcing princes and generals to return home for the Kurultai to choose his successor. In the spring of 1242, Beta Khan ordered his forces to pull back from Central Europe, retreating to the Russian steppes. This withdrawal has sparked debates among historians for ages. Sure, Gedai's death and the chaos that followed played a big part, but some folks think there were other reasons too. The Hungarian plain might have looked like home for the Mongol horses, but it just didn't offer enough good grazing for their huge herds. Each warrior needed up to 5 horses for their campaigns. After all, others believe the Mongols had already hit their targets, taking out Eastern Europe's military strength and showing off their power. Whatever the reasons, this sudden pullback gave Europe a much-needed breather that might have changed the course of history. The Mongols never again pushed so far into Central Europe with the same might, but the shadow of their return loomed over European politics for generations. The campaigns in Europe left a lasting mark. In the east, many Russian principalities fell under what's known as the Mongol yoke, or the rule of the Golden Horde, for over 2 centuries. This long stretch of control shaped Russian politics significantly, leading to a stronger central government in Moscow and the rise of autocratic rule that set Russia apart from Western Europe. Hungary, on the other hand, never really bounced back from the devastation. Before 1241, it was one of the most powerful and populated states in Europe. After the invasion, its population might have dropped by as much as 25%, leaving whole regions empty. Archaeological digs reveal abandoned villages and mass graves from this time. This demographic disaster created a power vacuum in Central Europe, paving the way for the Habsburg Empire to rise. For Western Europe, the invasion was a chilling wake-up call. Pope Gregory IX and his successor, Innocent IV, tried to rally resistance, even sending envoys to the east to negotiate or convert the invaders to Christianity. Although these missions didn't achieve their goals, they opened the door to the first real contact between Western Europe and distant Asia, bringing back crucial information about lands beyond the steppes. One of the most significant, yet often overlooked outcomes of the invasion was biological. The armies that moved across Eurasia acted as carriers for diseases. Some historians think the horrific Black Death that would later sweep through Europe actually started in the conquered areas, spreading along the trade routes the Mongols had secured and expanded. Even after pulling back from Central Europe, the Mongols were still a serious force in Eastern Europe. Under Bada Khan and his successors, the Golden Horde established its capital at Sarai on the lower Volga River, taking control of vast regions that now include Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Caucasus. From this stronghold, they launched raids into Poland, Lithuania, and the Balkans throughout the 13th and early 14th centuries. The Eastern threat really shook up European military thinking. The heavy cavalry charge, which had been the go-to tactic for medieval European armies, just didn't cut it against the agile steppe warriors. In the years that followed, European armies began to adapt, developing more flexible strategies and adding more missile troops to their ranks. Leaders like Matthias Corvinus of Hungary pushed military reforms directly shaped by the tough lessons learned from facing these fierce steppe fighters. Perhaps most importantly, the invasions shattered the isolation of medieval Europe. Thanks to the Pax Mongolica that followed these conquests, Europe gained unprecedented access to technologies, goods, and ideas from distant Asia. Marco Polo's famous journey to the court of Kublai Khan would have been impossible without the relative stability and openness of Mongol rule across Eurasia. As you settle into a cozy sleep, picture the profound relief that must have washed over Europe when news spread that the Eastern armies were withdrawing in 1242. Church bells that had been silent rang out across towns and villages. Prayers of thanks replaced desperate cries for help. For a brief moment, the people of Central Europe got a taste of what so many in Asia had already experienced: the overwhelming might of the steppe war machine and the radical transformation that followed in its wake. Yet even as Europe celebrated this unexpected break, the great empire was entering a time of incredible expansion and prosperity. With the death of Genghis Khan and the selection of Gayai Khan as his successor, the empire continued to grow under the leadership of Genghis Khan's descendants. The devastation of conquest would eventually give way to the remarkable phenomenon known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace that created the largest zone of free trade and cultural exchange the pre-modern world had ever known. The Mongol Empire at its peak, the golden age of trade and power. As we hit the middle of the 13th century, the massive empire stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe was truly in its golden age. This was a fantastic time of stability, prosperity, and cultural exchange, known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace. The wild waves of conquest that had reshaped much of the known world were finally calming down, leading to a period of relative peace under the rule of Genghis Khan's successors. After Gayai Khan passed away in 1241, there was a bit of a hiccup with succession. Following a few years of regency under Gedei's widow, Temujin, the Kurultai of 1246 chose Gayai Khan, Gedei's son, as the third great Khan. Unfortunately, his reign was short-lived, lasting just 2 years before he died in 1248. This led to another succession struggle, but eventually, Genghis Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan through his son Tolui, came to power in 1251. Under Mongol's strong leadership, the empire hit its peak size. Military campaigns were ongoing in multiple areas. His brother Hulagu took forces into the Middle East, conquering Baghdad in 1258 and wiping out the Abbasid Caliphate, while another brother, Kublai, focused on southern China. But as time went on, the emphasis shifted from just conquering to managing and administering the vast territories already under their control. During this time, the most extensive system of free trade and cultural exchange the pre-modern world had ever seen came into being. For the first time, people could travel from the shores of the Yellow Sea to the steppes of Hungary under the protection of one authority. The famous Silk Road, which had been up and down for centuries, was now running like a well-oiled machine, offering incredible efficiency and security. Khwarazmian, those handy way stations for merchants, popped up at regular intervals along major trade routes, giving travelers food, shelter, fresh mounts, and protection. This new commercial network was built on a clever infrastructure designed to help people move across vast distances. The imperial authorities rolled out the Yam system, a network of post stations set about a day's ride apart throughout the realm. Each station kept fresh horses, supplies, and accommodations for official messengers and authorized travelers. With a special Peza kind of authority tablet issued by the Khanna messenger, could grab horses and supplies at any station, covering up to 250 miles a day when it was urgent. This communication system linked territories separated by thousands of miles, allowing for quick transmission of information, orders, and intelligence all over Eurasia. The stability of this system depended on the ruthless elimination of banditry and local warfare within imperial territories. Merchants who once faced dangers at every political boundary could now travel under the protection of imperial law. According to contemporary accounts, it was said that a maiden bearing a nugget of gold on her head could wander safely throughout the realm. While that might be a bit of an exaggeration, it does capture the incredible security established across vast stretches that had previously been some of the most dangerous trade routes in the world. Taxation became organized, replacing the chaotic plunder of the conquest era. Census officials carefully counted households, livestock, and agricultural output to set regular tax obligations. While these taxes could be hefty, their predictability helped commerce and agriculture bounce back from the devastation of the initial invasions. In many areas, tax exemptions were granted to religious institutions and artisans practicing valuable crafts, which really encouraged the revival of cultural and economic life. Perhaps most impressively, the empire embraced a level of religious tolerance that was pretty groundbreaking for its time. While the ruling elite initially stuck to traditional shamanic beliefs, they took a practical approach to the diverse faiths of their subjects. Genghis Khan himself declared, "I don't distinguish the merit of one religion above another. I enforce respect for all religions and favor no one in particular." This policy continued under his successors, who exempted clergy of all faiths, Buddhist monks, Muslim imams, Christian priests, and others from taxation and conscription. This religious tolerance really opened the door for some amazing intellectual exchange across boundaries that were once pretty solid. In the bustling cities under imperial rule like Karakorum, Samarkand, Tabriz, and Beijing, scholars and clergy from all over Eurasia met each other, often for the very first time. You could feel the energy of debate and dialogue between these diverse traditions, especially at the imperial courts, where khans would set up formal discussions between representatives of different faiths. At its height, the empire had a fascinating administrative structure that blended nomadic traditions with bureaucratic systems borrowed from conquered lands. At the top was the Great Khan, whose authority came from the mandate of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a key part of steppe tradition. Below him, the empire was split into four major khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, led by Kublai Khan; the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia; the Ilkhanate in Persia; and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western steppes. Each khanate had a good amount of freedom while still recognizing the Great Khan's overall authority. This flexible setup allowed for different ways of managing things based on local needs. In China, for example, the Yuan dynasty embraced much of the existing Confucian bureaucracy, sticking to traditional institutions, but with a bit of imperial oversight. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the Ilkhanate started off with military governors, but gradually brought in local elites and Islamic administrative practices into their governance. Karakorum, the imperial capital set up by Genghis Khan in Mongolia, turned into a mini version of this multicultural empire. European visitors, like William of Rubruck, a Franciscan friar who popped by in 1254, were amazed by the diversity they found. Rubruck painted a picture of a city where Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and traditional shamans practiced their faiths openly, where Chinese architects designed the grand imperial palace, and where craftsmen from as far away as France created stunning works for the Khan's enjoyment. Inside this palace was perhaps the most famous example of cross-cultural tech exchange: a silver fountain crafted by Guillaume Boucher, a Parisian goldsmith who had been captured during campaigns in Hungary. This incredible piece dispensed fermented mare's milk, rice wine, mead, and other drinks from silver spouts shaped like lions, wowing guests at imperial feasts with its cleverness. It was a perfect symbol of the empire's knack for gathering talent from all corners of the world and putting it to work at the center of power. This time of relative peace also allowed for some serious technological sharing across Eurasia. Innovations that had been stuck in their own cultural bubbles suddenly zipped along imperial trade routes. Paper money, which first popped up in China, became widely used throughout the realm. Gunpowder, another cool Chinese invention, made its way westward, changing warfare in the Middle East and Europe forever. Printing techniques, astronomical instruments, mathematical concepts, and agricultural methods also spread across what used to be insurmountable cultural walls. The grand East-West exchange fostered by imperial rule changed the course of human civilization for good. Crops that transformed regional diets like rhubarb, lemons, carrots, and new wheat varieties traveled along these safe trade networks. Medical knowledge from the Islamic world reached China, while Chinese medical techniques made their way west. Even fashion got a makeover as textiles, designs, and techniques from all over Eurasia mixed together to create fresh styles. At the heart of this economic boom was a game-changing innovation: paper currency, backed by the full weight of the empire. First introduced in China, paper money was initially met with skepticism by merchants who were used to metal coins. But the convenience of paper for big transactions, along with tough penalties for counterfeiting or refusing to accept it, eventually made it a common sight throughout much of the realm. Marco Polo, the famous Venetian traveler, was blown away by this system, noting that the great Khan had mastered the alchemy of turning mulberry bark into money with the power of his seal. The commercial networks that sprang up during this time reached far beyond the empire's official borders. Trade goods from the empire made their way to places like sub-Saharan Africa, Scandinavia, and Southeast Asia through secondary networks. Venetian and Genoese merchants set up trading posts on the Black Sea to tap into these eastern trade routes, becoming key players in a commerce that would eventually change European economic life forever. And then there's Marco Polo, who really embodies the unique opportunities of this era. His famous travels kicked off in 1271, alongside his father and uncle, who were seasoned merchants. The young Venetian journeyed across Asia to reach Kublai Khan's court in China. He claimed to have spent 17 years in imperial service, soaking in the wealth, diversity, and sophistication of the Eastern realms. While modern historians might debate some details of his story, the very fact that he could make such a journey speaks volumes about the remarkable connections in the medieval world under imperial protection. But for all its triumphs, the Pax Mongolica had its share of contradictions that would eventually lead to its downfall. The success of the imperial system in facilitating movement across vast distances also created new vulnerabilities. Along with merchants, diplomats, and ideas, disease traveled those same protected trade routes with alarming speed. The Black Death, likely starting in Central Asia or China, spread along these routes in the mid-14th century, wiping out perhaps a third of Europe's population and causing similar devastation across much of Asia. Another contradiction was the struggle between nomadic traditions and settled governance. The original success of the imperial armies came from the martial skills honed through the nomadic lifestyle of the steppes. But as the ruling elite began to settle in cities, adopt the customs of the people they conquered, and blend into more sedentary administrative systems, their military edge started to fade. Future generations of imperial princes, raised in palaces instead of on horseback, found it tough to keep up the fierce discipline and toughness that defined their ancestors. Religious tensions bubbled up too, despite the official policy of tolerance. In the Ilkhanate, Hulig's destruction of Baghdad and the execution of the last Abbasid caliph in 1258 sparked deep resentment among Muslim subjects. Even though later Ilkhans converted to Islam, starting with Genghis Khan in 1295, the wounds from that conquest took a long time to heal. Similar issues popped up in China, where the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan favored foreign administrators over local Chinese officials, leading to resentment that eventually contributed to the dynasty's downfall. Keeping political unity across such vast and diverse territories proved tricky. The death of Genghis Khan in 1259 kicked off a civil war between his brothers, Kublai and Arak Beki, which essentially split the empire. Kublai came out on top, but in the following decades, the empire began to fragment. By the end of the 13th century, the four major khanates operated like independent states, connected by family ties and cultural links, but increasingly following their own paths. Even as political fragmentation sped up, the commercial and cultural networks built during the imperial era kept on rolling. The decline of central authority was gradual, not a sudden crash. Trade routes remained active, ideas kept flowing, and many administrative innovations stuck around even as the political structure fell apart. The legacy of this incredible period lasted long after the political systems that created it faded away. The idea of Eurasian unity, first realized under imperial rule, would inspire later conquerors. From Timur to the Russian Tsars, the extensive commercial network set up during this time laid the groundwork for the emerging global economy of the early modern period. Plus, the unprecedented exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures would change the course of human civilization forever, breaking down the isolation of regional knowledge systems and paving the way for the scientific and commercial revolutions that would transform the world. As you drift deeper into sleep, picture yourself as a traveler on the Silk Road during this remarkable era. Imagine the caravans of two-humped Bactrian camels loaded with silk, spices, and porcelain crossing the windswept plains of Central Asia. Visualize the bustling markets of Samarkand and Bukhara, where merchants from India, China, Persia, and Europe haggled in a dozen languages. Think about the scholars in Baghdad and Tabriz poring over astronomical texts from China, alongside medical treatises from Greece, blending knowledge from distant traditions into new insights. This world connected yet diverse, harsh in its beginnings, yet surprisingly open in its later stages, was a unique moment in human history when the walls between civilizations came down, if only for a while. While it proved impossible to keep political unity over such vast territories filled with different cultures, the dream of a connected Eurasia first realized in this period would echo through the centuries to come. But even at the peak of its power and prosperity, signs of future challenges were starting to appear. The sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan, raised in the comfort of palaces instead of the roughness of the steppes, began to lose the fierce qualities that fueled the initial conquests. Succession disputes became more frequent and destructive, and in the diverse territories under imperial rule, new forces were gaining strength that would eventually challenge the authority of the great Khan's descendants. The story now shifts toward decline. The slow breakup of the United Empire into separate khanates, the challenges they faced from internal rebellions and external enemies, and the eventual disappearance of the world system first established by Genghis Khan and his immediate successors. Yet this decline, just like the rise that came before it, would reshape the map of Eurasia and leave a lasting mark on human civilization. The fall of the Mongol Empire, internal struggles and division. All great empires eventually face decline, and the vast realm built by Genghis Khan is no different. As you start to drift off to sleep, let's dive into how the largest contiguous land empire in history gradually broke apart, shifting from a united global power into separate kingdoms with their own paths. The seeds of division were sown even during the empire's peak. When Genghis Khan passed away in 1259, while fighting the southern Song dynasty in China, there was no clear plan for succession. His brothers, Kublai and Arik Boke, both wanted the throne, which sparked the first major civil war within the family. Kublai eventually came out on top in 1264, but this conflict changed the game for imperial unity. Once Kublai Khan secured his position as the Great Khan, he made a bold move that highlighted the growing divide in the empire. He shifted the capital from Karakoram in Mongolia to Kandalik, now Beijing, kicking off the Yuan dynasty in China. This choice helped him manage the wealthy Chinese territories better, but it alienated the traditional steppe aristocracy, who felt he was abandoning their ways. Many nobles in Mongolia refused to recognize Kublai's authority, seeing him as too influenced by Chinese culture and governance. This split between traditionalists wanting to keep nomadic customs and pragmatists adapting to a settled lifestyle would continue to chip away at imperial unity in the years to come. As a result, the empire split into four major khanates, each taking its own path. The Yuan dynasty in China, under Kublai Khan, represented the biggest shift towards a sedentary lifestyle. Ruling over the world's most populous and advanced society, Kublai and his successors adopted many aspects of Chinese governance while still holding on to their identity as conquerors. They set up a multi-ethnic administration that ranked subjects in a hierarchy, with themselves at the top, followed by Central Asian peoples, Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese. While this system worked for a time, it created deep resentments among the native population, which eventually sparked rebellion. Despite these tensions, the Yuan period saw some incredible cultural and technological achievements. Drama and literature thrived, producing classics like The Romance of the Western Chamber. Scholars like Guo Shujing made significant strides in math, reforming the calendar and improving irrigation systems. The beautiful blue and white porcelain that later became China's signature style also emerged during this time, often featuring designs from all over the empire. However, the Yuan rulers faced ongoing challenges. Major flooding along the Yellow River in the 1340s devastated the northern heartland. Meanwhile, paper currency, which had initially been a strength, suffered from severe inflation as successive Khans printed money to cover budget shortfalls. By the mid-14th century, widespread unrest bubbled up in movements like the Red Turbans, a Buddhist sect that launched large-scale rebellions against Yuan rule. Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant who had joined a Red Turban uprising, gradually united rebel forces and marched on the Yuan capital. In 1368, the last Yuan emperor fled north to the Mongolian steppe, marking the end of the dynasty's rule over China and paving the way for the native Ming dynasty, which would govern China for the next 3 centuries. The Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East took a unique route in its development. Founded by Hulagu Khan after his intense campaign against the Islamic world, this Khanate slowly blended into the cultural landscape it had conquered. A major turning point happened when Ghazan Khan converted to Islam in 1295, which really sped up the assimilation process. Under his leadership and that of his successors, especially Glaju and Abu Sa'id, Persian administrative systems were largely revived, leading to a cultural renaissance. This era saw the creation of breathtaking structures like the Sultaniyya Dome, a stunning example of Islamic architecture that showcased influences from across the region. Persian historical writing also thrived during this time, with scholars like Rashid al-Din making significant contributions. His work, Universal History, was the first attempt to compile a comprehensive account of world history, drawing from European, Chinese, Indian, and Middle Eastern sources. This incredible achievement was only possible because of the vast information exchange fostered by the empire. But despite these cultural wins, the Ilkhanate faced its share of economic troubles and succession disputes. After Abu Sa'id passed away in 1335 without an heir, the Khanate fell apart into competing regional dynasties. This effectively ended the direct rule by Genghis Khan's descendants in the area, although local rulers still claimed ties to the imperial lineage to legitimize their power. Meanwhile, the Golden Horde, which controlled Russia and the Western steppe, managed to keep its nomadic lifestyle better than the other Khanates. This might have been because its lands included vast grasslands, perfect for traditional pastoral living. From their capital at Sarai on the lower Volga, the Khans governed a diverse realm that included Russian principalities, Finnic peoples, and various Turkic tribes. Under Berk Khan, who ruled from 1257 to 1266, The Golden Horde embraced Islam, aligning culturally with the Muslim world instead of the Buddhist and shamanistic traditions that were gaining traction in the eastern parts of the empire. This shift in religion created a lasting divide within the broader imperial sphere. The Golden Horde's relationship with its Russian subjects established patterns that would shape Russian political development for centuries. Russian princes had to travel to Sarai to get permission to rule their territories, which reinforced centralized authority but also sparked resentment. The special treatment given to the princes of Moscow, especially their right to collect tribute on behalf of the Khan, unintentionally bolstered what would eventually become the dominant Russian state. On the other hand, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, named after Genghis Khan's second son, saw perhaps the most striking internal division. By the early 14th century, it had split into two distinct regions: the Western Chagatai realm, which gradually converted to Islam and adopted a sedentary lifestyle, and Mongolistan in the east, which held on to traditional nomadic ways and resisted Islamic influence. This division highlighted the broader tensions within the imperial tradition, the struggle between ancestral steppe practices and the administrative needs of governing agricultural societies. It also showed how geography influenced these different paths, as areas with extensive grasslands could support nomadic traditions, while regions dominated by farms and cities needed different governance approaches. Several factors sped up the empire's fragmentation. One of the main issues was ecological. The late 13th and early 14th centuries marked the start of a climatic cooling period later known as the Little Ice Age. This climate shift reduced grass production on the Eurasian steppe, which hurt the pastoral economy that had fueled the empire's expansion. Droughts and harsh winters diminished the massive horse herds that were the backbone of military power, slowly eroding the advantage that steppe warriors had over settled societies. Disease also dealt a catastrophic blow. The extensive connectivity established during the Pax Mongolica created perfect conditions for pandemics to spread. The Black Death, likely starting in the grasslands of Central Asia, raced along trade routes in the 1340s, eventually killing between 30% and 50% of the population across much of Eurasia. Beyond its devastating human toll, this demographic collapse disrupted economic systems, especially in China and the Middle East, further weakening the imperial authority. Military factors played a big role in the decline of the Mongol Empire. As the imperial forces settled into administrative roles, they slowly lost the incredible martial skills that had made their early conquests so successful. The kids of the ruling elite grew up in palaces instead of on horseback, so they never really developed the horsemanship, archery, and toughness that gave their ancestors such an edge in battle. Meanwhile, their enemies were adapting, picking up steppe tactics and technology to strengthen their own military systems. This decline in military prowess became super clear during a series of failed campaigns. The Yuan dynasty, for instance, launched disastrous naval expeditions against Japan in 1274 and 1281, both of which ended in catastrophic failure when typhoons, often called divine winds or kamikaze, wiped out their fleets. Similar defeats happened in Southeast Asia, where campaigns against Vietnam and Java faced fierce resistance and tricky terrain. These setbacks really chipped away at the empire's once invincible reputation. One of the biggest reasons for the empire's fragmentation was the weakening of the weak ideological foundation that Genghis Khan had established. His original vision blended traditional steppe values with a practical approach, taking in useful elements from the cultures they conquered, while keeping core nomadic virtues like loyalty, discipline, and meritocracy. But as time went on, this balanced approach gave way to two extremes. Some leaned too much into conservatism, rejecting outside influences and clinging to rigid steppe traditions, while others assimilated too much, adopting the customs, religions, and governance styles of the peoples they had conquered. Both extremes undermined the flexible mix that had made the empire's initial expansion so successful. The Yuan dynasty in China really shows the challenges that came from these contradictions. Kublai Khan tried to rule China through a complicated administrative system that mixed traditional Chinese bureaucracy with a multi-ethnic elite drawn from across the empire. While it was innovative, this approach didn't please either the traditional Mongol nobility, who felt it abandoned their ways, or the Chinese elite, who resented being in a subordinate position. By the 1340s, these tensions, combined with natural disasters, currency collapse, and the devastation of the Black Death, created a perfect storm for rebellion. Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant who had joined a Red Turban uprising, gradually brought together rebel forces and marched on the Yuan capital. In 1368, the last Yuan emperor fled north to the Mongolian steppe, marking the end of the dynasty's rule over China and paving the way for the native Ming dynasty, which would govern China for the next 3 centuries. But the retreat from China didn't mean the end of the imperial legacy in East Asia. The Yuan rulers set up the Northern Yuan dynasty in Mongolia, keeping their claims to China alive for generations, and sometimes launching campaigns to reclaim lost territories. Meanwhile, their cousins in the Western Khanats continued to rule significant parts of Central Asia, Russia, and the Middle East, though their connections to one another grew increasingly weak. What's really interesting about the decline of the empire is how uneven it was. Political unity broke apart relatively quickly, but the commercial networks, cultural exchanges, and technological diffusion that had been established during the imperial era continued long after the central authority faded. Caravans still traveled along the Silk Road. Ideas kept flowing across boundaries that used to be hard to cross, and many administrative innovations survived even after the political disintegration of the United Empire. The legacy of this incredible period would last long after the political structures that created it had vanished. The vision of Eurasian unity that Genghis Khan first realized under his rule would continue to inspire later conquerors. From Timur to the Russian Tsars, the vast commercial networks set up during this time would lay the groundwork for the emerging global economy of the early modern period. Plus, the unprecedented exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures would change the course of human civilization forever, breaking down the isolation of regional knowledge systems and setting the stage for the scientific and commercial revolutions that would later transform the world. As you drift off to sleep, picture the last descendants of those mighty conquerors still living in the grasslands of Mongolia, looking up at the same eternal blue sky that inspired their ancestor. Even though their political power has faded, the echoes of their impact still resonate across Eurasian trade routes, in diplomatic practices, in the movement of peoples, and in the exchange of ideas. The decline of the largest contiguous land empire in history wasn't just a straightforward collapse. It was a complicated transformation. Over time, the structures of imperial rule began to shift, giving way to new political setups that still held on to many elements from that incredible mix created during the conquests. Even as direct control faded, the dream of a united Eurasia, once protected by imperial power, continued to inspire future conquerors, from the Russian Tsars to the Mughals in India. But the complete breakdown of the imperial system was still ahead. The last bits of the Golden Horde in Russia, the scattered successor states in Central Asia, and the northern Yuan in Mongolia faced fresh challenges in the centuries to come, like the rise of gunpowder empires and the spread of Russian influence across northern Eurasia. Their ultimate fate, along with the lasting legacy of Genghis Khan's extraordinary empire, would play out across lands stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, weaving a tale of adaptation, resistance, and transformation in a world that was constantly changing. The last days of the Mongols. How the greatest empire disappeared as the echoes of imperial glory faded across Eurasia. The once mighty realm began its final chapter. The last days of this great steppe empire didn't happen overnight. It was more like a slow fade over centuries instead of a dramatic collapse. As you settle in for the night, let's explore how the last remnants of this incredible historical phenomenon gradually vanished from the world stage, leaving behind a legacy that still shapes our lives today. Each successor state took its own unique path, influenced by geography, local conditions, and the rise of new regional powers. In the easternmost territories, the Northern Yuan dynasty was established by the royal family after they were kicked out of China. They held on to a strong connection with their original homeland. Retreating to the Mongolian plateau, these descendants of Kublai Khan kept traditional steppe culture alive while dreaming of reclaiming China. And honestly, their ambitions weren't entirely out of reach. Under Togun Timur, the last Yuan emperor to rule China, and his successors, the northern Yuan maintained considerable military power and repeatedly raided Ming territory for years. The Ming dynasty poured tons of resources into fighting this ongoing threat, building elaborate defensive networks that eventually turned into parts of the Great Wall we see today. The northern Yuan faced a major setback in 1388 when Ming forces, led by General Lan Yu, defeated them at the Battle of Beer Lake. This devastating loss wiped out much of the remaining imperial nobility and scattered the survivors. Although the northern Yuan limped along nominally until the 1600s, they never posed a serious threat to China again. They became increasingly confined to their homeland and lost territory to the rising Oirat Confederation in western Mongolia. Their slow decline sped up in the late 16th century when Altan Khan, a powerful Mongol leader, converted to Tibetan Buddhism and formed a close bond with the Gelug school, even giving the title of Dalai Lama to its leader. This religious shift transformed steppe culture, turning monasteries into power centers and leading many men to choose monastic life over becoming warriors. The fierce martial traditions that had fueled their original conquests began to fade away as Buddhist values of nonviolence took over. By the 17th century, Mongolia had splintered into various competing khanates. This fragmentation left them vulnerable to a new nomadic power, the Manchu. In 1636, the southern Mongols submitted to Manchu authority, and by 1691, most of Inner Mongolia had been absorbed into the Qing dynasty. Outer Mongolia held on to its independence a bit longer, but by 1755, it too came under Qing control, marking the end of the last direct political connection to the imperial legacy in its homeland. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate had a pretty wild ride, full of twists and turns. By the mid-14th century, it was already splitting apart. The western part was getting cozy with the Islamic world, while the eastern region of Mongolistan was holding tight to its traditional steppe roots. Over time, this divide grew as different political and cultural influences took hold in each area. The Western Xia lands eventually morphed into the Timurid Empire after Timur's conquests in the late 14th century. Now, even though Timur claimed to be connected to the imperial lineage through marriage, he definitely took cues from the old empire, mixing steppe military tactics with Islamic governance. Just look at the stunning buildings he left behind in Samarkand. They're a beautiful blend of styles from all over, from Persia to India. After Timur passed away in 1405, his empire broke apart among his heirs, and one of them, Babur, went on to establish the Mughal Empire in India in 1526. He managed to keep some steppe traditions alive, even as things got more Persian and later Indian. Fun fact, the name Mughal actually comes from Mongol, which is a cool reminder of their roots, even if the cultural ties got a bit loose. Meanwhile, the eastern Chagatai lands took a different route, getting absorbed into the Jongar Khanate. This powerful group of Western Mongol tribes briefly formed the last great nomadic empire in the 17th and early 18th centuries, controlling a massive stretch of land from the Altai Mountains to eastern Kazakhstan before being wiped out by Qing expansion in the 1750s. The Ilkhanate in Persia had already crumbled by the mid-14th century, breaking apart into various regional dynasties. The plague, economic chaos, and succession squabbles really took a toll on central authority. But even as the political scene fell apart, cultural blending kept on thriving. The Jalayirid and Timurid dynasties that emerged from this breakdown not only preserved, but also enriched the amazing artistic and intellectual traditions that had flourished during the imperial days. Persian painting hit new levels of sophistication, mixing Chinese-inspired landscape techniques with Islamic art styles. Historical writing also took off, keeping important records of the imperial era alive, while Persian administrative systems, which had been adapted and refined during Ilkhanid rule, spread to neighboring areas, shaping governance from Anatolia all the way to India. By the 16th century, the rise of the Safavid dynasty in Persia created a new regional order focused on Shia Islam, largely wiping out the political legacy of steppe rule while absorbing many cultural and administrative innovations. Meanwhile, further west, the Ottoman Empire was also getting in on the action, incorporating elements of steppe military tactics and administrative practices into a state that was increasingly rooted in Islamic and Byzantine traditions. Now, let's talk about the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western steppes, where things got really dramatic. Starting in the late 14th century, this once mighty Khanate began to splinter, breaking into several competing hordes. The Great Horde, which controlled the core territories around the Volga, the Crimean Khanate on the Black Sea coast, the Kazakh Khanate in the eastern steppes, the Astrakhan Khanate at the mouth of the Volga, and the Sibir Khanate in western Siberia. This fragmentation happened just as the Grand Duchy of Moscow was rising to power. Initially, Moscow had become strong by collecting tribute for the Khans, but under leaders like Ivan III, they started to assert their independence, refusing to pay tribute and gradually expanding their territory. The turning point came in 1480 when Grand Prince Ivan III flat out refused to pay homage to Khan Akhmet of the Great Horde, marking the end of Muscovite submission to steppe authority. Over the next few centuries, the Russian state systematically absorbed the territories of the former Golden Horde. In 1552, Ivan IV, known as the Terrible, conquered the Khanate of Kazan, and by 1556, the Khanate of Astrakhan fell as well. These victories gave Russia control over the entire Volga River Valley, effectively cutting off the remaining steppe powers from one another. The Sibir Khanate met its end at the hands of Cossack adventurers in the 1580s, paving the way for Russian colonization of Siberia. The Crimean Khanate held on to its independence a bit longer by aligning with the Ottomans, even launching devastating raids into Russian territory as late as 1571, when they famously burned Moscow. But eventually, even this last powerful successor state fell, getting annexed by Catherine the Great's Russian Empire in 1783. The Kazakh Khanate, the last significant remnant, maintained its independence until the 18th century, when Russian expansion slowly chipped away at their territory and autonomy. By the 1820s, the remaining Kazakh lands were fully absorbed into the Russian Empire, marking the final disappearance of independent political entities that had descended from the original imperial structure. This whole process of how these successor states got absorbed into expanding agricultural empires, Russian, Chinese, and others, reveals a pretty interesting historical twist. The incredible success of the imperial conquests actually set the stage for the eventual rise of the sedentary civilizations they once dominated. By linking distant regions through protected trade routes, the imperial system helped spread technology that gradually weakened the military edge of steppe warriors. Gunpowder weapons, which made their way to Europe partly through the interconnected trading world of the Pax Mongolica, eventually leveled the playing field against the composite bow. The organizational techniques developed by imperial armies were studied and adapted by their former subjects, leading to military systems that could match the mobility of the steppe while fielding much larger forces. Climate change really took a toll on the traditional advantages of the steppe. The Little Ice Age, which kicked off in the late medieval period, hit the Eurasian grasslands hard. It cut down the productivity of these vast lands, which meant fewer horses could be kept. And you know what that means? Less military power for the nomadic societies that relied on those herds. As the pastures became less reliable, the very economic base of steppe power began to crumble. On top of that, religious and cultural shifts played a huge role in this historical shift. Many people from the steppe started converting to universal religions, Islam in the West and Buddhism in the East. This shift gradually replaced the spiritual beliefs that had fueled the original conquests. The fierce warrior spirit that Genghis Khan had tapped into gave way to new value systems that often prioritized stability and religious devotion over expansion and conquest. Even though the political structures built by those imperial conquests started to fade away, their legacy stuck around in surprising ways. You can still see the linguistic patterns across Eurasia that reflect the massive population movements sparked by the rise and fall of the empire. For instance, the Turkic languages we hear today, spoken from Turkey to Xinjiang, spread during this time, often pushing aside earlier Indo-European languages. And get this, genetic studies of modern populations have revealed some fascinating stuff. Researchers found a Y chromosomal lineage present in about 8% of men across a huge swath of Asia, likely linked to the imperial expansion and the reproductive opportunities it created for the elite conquerors. This means that today, around 16 million men might carry genes that trace back to the ruling clan of that time, what scientists have dubbed the Genghis Khan effect. Cultural and institutional legacies turned out to be just as enduring. The political development of Russia was heavily influenced by centuries of interaction with steppe powers, affecting everything from governance practices to how they handled diplomacy. Chinese administrative systems also picked up many innovations from the Yuan dynasty. And in Central Asia, social structures still show traces of the tribal reorganizations that took place under imperial rule. Even the layout of the modern world reflects this historical period. Many of today's national borders in Central Asia roughly follow the lines that divided imperial administrative units, or successor khanates. The way ethnic and linguistic groups are spread out across Eurasia still echoes the population movements from that time. And the modern Mongolian nation, even though it occupies just a fraction of the original imperial territory, keeps a cultural connection to the homeland of Genghis Khan. But perhaps the most striking legacy is found in how people remember this history and how it shapes national identity today. For many modern Mongolians, the imperial era is viewed as a golden age with global significance, serving as a source of pride and identity in today's world. You'll find streets, airports, and businesses in Ulaanbaatar named after Genghis Khan, and his image pops up on everything from vodka bottles to hotels. In other regions that were once under imperial rule, the historical memory is a bit more complicated and often contested. In Russia, the relationship with the Golden Horde is a sensitive topic. Some see it as a yoke that held back Russian development, while others view it as a key influence that shaped Russian uniqueness. In China, the official history has swung between seeing the Yuan dynasty as foreign oppressors and as legitimate rulers who contributed to the country's historical development and territorial expansion. Central Asia's legacy is equally complex. The modern nations in that region trace intricate lineages back to this period. Even the name Kazakhstan keeps alive the memory of the Kipchak steppe peoples, who were a significant part of the Golden Horde. Yet these national histories have to deal with the destruction caused by the original conquests, leading to narratives that recognize both the devastation and the new cultural blends that emerge from it. As we wrap up this journey through history, let's reflect on the incredible arc we've traced, from the humble beginnings of a miner, chieftain's son on the Mongolian steppe, to the rise of the largest contiguous land empire in human history, followed by its gradual transformation and eventual disappearance. Few historical events have reshaped human civilization so dramatically or left such diverse and lasting legacies across such a vast area of the globe. The disappearance of the great steppe empire wasn't just some big, dramatic event. It was more like a slow dance of adaptation, absorption, and transformation. The conquerors found themselves gradually conquered, and the rulers ended up being ruled. In this fascinating process, they changed the societies they encountered forever, leaving a lasting mark on human history. As you drift off to sleep, picture those endless horizons of the Mongolian plateau where this incredible story kicked off. Imagine the cozy felt tents under the vast sky, horses munching on the windswept grass, and think about how such humble beginnings led to an empire that, even though it's been politically gone for centuries, still shapes our world in countless subtle ways. From the genes we carry to the borders on our maps, from the languages we speak to the historical memories that define our national identities. The empire built by Genghis Khan and his successors may have vanished like morning mist, but the world it created, connected, transformed, and forever changed remains our legacy. As you finally drift into slumber, hold on to the echo of hoofbeats from centuries past, the rise and fall of the greatest land empire ever, and the lasting legacy of Genghis Khan, the universal ruler who briefly united the Eurasian world and changed the course of human history forever. And so, our journey into the past comes to a quiet close. If you're still awake with me, I hope this tale brought you a little peace. If you enjoyed our time together, a gentle like lets me know. And subscribing means you'll never miss the next calm adventure. If you know someone who might need a little comfort tonight, feel free to share this story with them. Thank you, truly, for being here. Until next time, I wish you the sweetest dreams.